Mr. Laird, you said the budget is balanced in every way. Senator Hollingsworth just told reporters that he thinks it's out of operational balance by about $2 billion, meaning that it will spend that much more than the state actually takes in during the fiscal year, if I understand it correctly. What's your view of that? I know when the Mayor e-buys came out, the Republicans were saying they thought it was $1.5 billion out of what they call operational balance, and Senator Hollingsworth seems to think the Congress committee actions that they added, $500 million thereabouts to that.
I think basically that is a moving target, that is an abstract target, and we just did a budget that's based on what we know. And let's just step back, because the key issue is the reserve. I told you that the reserve is over $2 billion, and it is actually even higher if you consider the governor's transit money to not be achievable. In November 2006, the legislative analysts projected a year-end reserve for next year's budget of minus $2.4 billion, and we have a $2.1 billion reserve right now in this budget. At the same time, in November 2005, the LAO projected a year-end reserve of $1.2 billion. Turned out to be $3.7 billion. In the year before, November 2004, the LAO projected a negative reserve of $6.7 billion, and we actually ended up with a positive $10.1 billion. So every single year, there have been projections that haven't, of the last three, that have not been borne out. And so based on what we know now, we've done a reserve, and that's a significant thing, that's over $2 billion, that's equal to the governor's. And if we are to go back and accept an arbitrary number that is exactly what's changed every year in the past years in significant ways, and say that's the reason that we shouldn't give a cost of living increase to people on Social Security, or that's the reason that parents across California should pay higher fees to UC or CSU, that's the reason we should cut back services to kids. That's not something that we're prepared to do because we don't believe there's a reason to do.
Is the Williamson Act money in this budget or not?
The Williamson Act money is in this budget. And I would just note that when Gray Davis cut the money, there were posters for restorations on the doors of every Republican in the Capitol. And it was cut this year, and we put it back, and there wasn't a single poster on the door. And I really would have appreciated it. They would have done it along and got them out.
Let me echo a little bit. It's always the budget document is an estimate document, and it is an estimate of reserves, it is an estimate of expenditures, it is an estimate based on the best knowledge we have at the moment, and that's why those numbers at the end of the year often change, and we do have greater reserves than we thought. We have emergencies sometimes where we spend more than what we initially thought. On the other hand, we end up with savings because caseloads shift and maybe aren't quite what we thought because we've accounted for hiring people who don't always get hired as quickly as we'd like. I mean, an ongoing issue that I think all of us are looking at, state employees, is how do we recruit and retain employees? That's why we did augmentation sufficient gain in some of the areas where we don't have enough gain wardens and some other areas. But when you fund the positions, and then it's not always clear when they're going to get hired. So in the end, there's often savings in the budget that sort of you can't reflect when you're doing the budget at the front end of the fiscal year. And so this question of how much is there, and how do you really look at the operational, the revenues and expenditures. And the truth is we have money that is from this year. The fact that we're using some of that to fund next year's doesn't necessarily mean that money won't also again be there next year, or that some of it's being used for things that will in fact be one-time expenses, which is not as appropriate. And breaking out of a $140 billion document what is actually one-time expenditures and which are ongoing expenditures, I mean, that's always a complicated process. And but some of these things are capital, some of these things are projects that only require funding this year and next year won't. And so on that basis, difficult to reconcile the numbers that I know all of our Republican colleagues are using to argue that there's not balance. But in fact, we think it is a balanced budget and that it is prudent and has sufficient reserve to cover the